So I'd like to welcome you to our next event, one of the feature presentations of this conference. And this is a plenary presentation by Micheal O'Siadhail. Micheal O'Siadhail is one of our greatest living poets. As I said the other day when I was introducing him for the book launch of his new volume, Psalter, that's the first section, Testament is the name of it. He is both a polyglot and a polymath. As for evidence of his polyglotness, you could see his well-known grammar of Irish language published by Harvard. Micheal is also conversant in Japanese, as some of you may have seen the other day if you attended that reading, and Norwegian, among other languages. He is also a true polymath, sometimes an overused term, but if you've had a chance to look at his so far penultimate volume, not penultimate, I hope, ultimately. This is the 5 quintets. You can get a real sense of his reach and sweep and breadth in his survey of intellectual and spiritual history from the Enlightenment to the present. So, the areas he covers include the economy, science, literature and the arts, theology, and politics. And he's actually done all the readings in economics and in science. It's fantastic. What I want to really talk with you about, though, today is how Micheal has become one of our great devotional poets. In the future, when the ranks of devotional poets are called, along with the names of Donne and Herbert, Richard Wilbur, and T.S. Eliot, will be called the name of Micheal O'Siadhail. The book I just mentioned, 5 Quintets, not only has an unabashed celebration of the Lord God, but gives you a sense of the exuberant joy that has become one of his hallmarks. About that book, one of our leading theologians, Tom Wright, has said this: "It's a giant symphony with vast sweeping tunes and small lyrical moments building to a sustained climax. It's an intellectual, cultural, and political history of the modern Western world. It's a portrait gallery with over 100 sharply etched miniatures, Cervantes, Donne, and Rubens, all the way to Kierkegaard, Levinas, and Ricoeur. And these," Wright goes on to say, "are talking portraits. Since the poet not only describes them and addresses them, but lets them answer him back, it is, above all, a party, with dancing and delight, with the rhythms of the poetry setting our feet tapping and our hearts soaring." Now, with the newly launched volume of poems that I just mentioned, Testament, published by Baylor, Micheal throws down the metaphorical gauntlet in a challenge to our secularizing age. As he says himself in a recent essay in the Irish Times, shortly before former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, launched Testament in Dublin, and which U.S. poet has ever had a book launch by the president? This is amazing, right? In a new book of poems, this is Micheal again, Testament, I have dared a psalter with 150 many-mooted psalms of my own. I use the word dared advisedly. I've been building up to this for a long time. My worldview has suffused all my poetry, but this is different. This is a coming out. I know that such a work is of its nature controversial and may well fly in the face of the spirit of the age. I feel it may be particularly countercultural in a newly secularized Ireland. I know these changes are an understandable reaction to some of the narrow-mindedness, censorship, and abuses of the past, often in the name of religion. But on the other hand, he says, I sense a deep thirst for meaning, for some greater context for our lives. Testament offers living wells of water for that deep thirst in our current age. Comprised of a brilliant first section, Psalter, in which Micheal offers 150 contemporary psalms that both praise God and lament the state of our world, and a second section, Gospel, wherein he retells in vivid poetry seminal stories from the Gospels. This new volume testifies not only to Micheal's enduring gifts as a wordsmith of the highest order, but also to the Logos, who spoke the universe into being. It's my honor to welcome him back to Baylor, back to this fantastic conference hosted by the Institute for Faith and Learning, to offer his thoughts on this feature presentation entitled, To Understand or to Be Understood, A Poet's Perspective. Micheal will speak for 40-ish minutes, then he'll take questions from the audience, focused upon the issues brought out by his talk. Ladies and gentlemen, Micheal O'Siadhail.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. It's a very competitive business here. I believe there's nine other talks going on at the same time, so thank you for choosing to come here. Art Seeking Understanding. It's such a delight, I've got to say, to be here and be part of this conference, particularly here at Baylor, whose university press has published all my poetry here in the United States, most recently, as Richard said, Testament, which was launched the evening before last in the Armstrong Browning Library. And I've got to say, dealing with Baylor University Press has been one of the great pleasures. They've been extraordinary to deal with and wonderful people to work with. Now, it's a privilege and a pleasure to contribute and to speak to you as a poet on this theme, Art Seeking Understanding. I'm particularly delighted as it's a theme which has always been of importance to me. Indeed, I would say that it suggests a view, even a vision of art, that has shaped and informed my own sense of vocation throughout my life. But I can't say that this was my title. I've never before been in a position where I was at a conference where I was presented with a title. David is laughing, he must have done it. It's quite extraordinary. I was simply given the title to understand or be understood. I feel somewhat like one of those great classical composers of the past who prided themselves in their ability to improvise. But my immediate reaction when given the title was to think, surely this must be an allusion to St. Francis. Only David can answer that question, but I took it as such immediately as the prayer, it's an allusion to the famous prayer of St. Francis. O maestro che feico non certi tanto ad essere compreso quanto a comprendere. O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. The prayer of St. Francis. I think it's providential because as a boy, St. Francis was always my favorite saint. When I discovered he could talk to animals, I spent my life since talking to animals. Of course, the prayer of St. Francis has become especially familiar through a hymn, Make Me the Channel of Your Peace, which I was to first learn when my late wife, my first wife, was in a home, and it was a home for ladies, and I was the only male voice on a Sunday, and I didn't know some of the hymns because they'd been introduced in Vatican II, so I used to, late on a Saturday night, sit in my study with YouTube on, learning, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace. Now, very fortunately, understanding and being understood are not mutually exclusive. The choice between understanding and being understood is not a simple binary choice, a simplistic either-or. We can both in life and in art hope for both. Perhaps what Francis's prayer is asking for is the grace to prioritize understanding over being understood. And maybe that is also the sequence in which a poet can work best. I think I need to start by addressing the difference between entertainment and art. Entertainment, it seems to me, is distraction without depth. It's hard not to think of T.S. Eliot's four quartets, and that line in Burnt Norton describing modern culture as where we are distracted by distraction, from distraction by distraction. However distracted we were when Burnt Norton was first published in 1936, who could have imagined how sidetracked, how diverted we are in a world where the avowed intention of the high priests of the internet is to dominate our attention all the time. Of course, the perception of poets as dreamy, mysterious figures which stems from the Romantic era, allows poets themselves to turn their art into entertainment. On one hand, we can be tempted to write excessively self-indulgent confessional poetry, and on the other hand, to seek to subvert the Romantic image by presenting poetry as a kind of stand-up comedy which undermines any serious intent. Art, on the other hand, addresses a richness of both intellectual and imaginative meaning. We want intense, well-shaped communication which grips and stretches us and which makes rich and fuller sense of the world. It is the gift to embrace and celebrate life in all its depth and richness, its delights and griefs, its suffering and its joy. Already, I find myself using meaning almost as a synonym for understanding. I think when we speak of art seeking understanding, we are talking of art seeking to make some sense of the world, to find meaning in our human lives. Yet it seems to me that it's worth pausing here to think through some of the different ways of expressing understanding. Now, this morning, Lou talked about language, talked about words as being a home, and of course language is a kind of dwelling as well. So let's think a little bit about the word understanding. It's interesting how English stands under something, while other Germanic languages seem to stand before something. I'm thinking of, obviously, of German verstehen, or Norwegian forstå, and so forth. I really like the idea of standing before or around in the presence of something, which almost implies a sense of wonder that in turn is a beholding with love. Maybe it's no coincidence at all that the next line of St. Francis of Assisi's prayer is ad essere amato quanto am amare, to be loved as to love. The deepest beholding is a kind of loving. Interestingly, the Latin intendere, which survives in Romance languages, for instance, French entendre, originally meant to stretch out, to direct one's attention to something. There are several other ways of understanding which are less standing in the presence of something or being attentive, but more possessive. The idea of understanding is interpreted as to get something, to grasp something, to catch on. The Irish tishkint is basically simply to get. And the verb to comprehend, which is based on Latin prehendere, to sense before, supplies the verb for several Romance languages, just as capere, which gives Italian capire, is in essence to catch a hold of something. Fascinatingly, two languages as geographically apart as Icelandic and Japanese conceive of the idea of understanding as separating. It's in Icelandic, it's skilja, the word, of course, which gives you shilling in English. It's a division, obviously separating something. And, of course, Japanese, wakeru, which also means to divide or to understand. So I asked the question, I wonder, what are they thinking of separating? Might it be that it's the true from the false? Again, St. Francis, dove è l'errore che opporti la verità? Where there is error, let me bring truth. So this brief etymological detour suggests that maybe understanding is an attentive and truthful beholding in love that we try to hold on to. Then is art seeking understanding, this attentive, truthful, and loving beholding of life in all its richness in an attempt to make sense of it all. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it, and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more. Certainly for anyone aware of the brevity of our sojourn, as that psalmist was, there is an inevitable urge to ask, what is it all about? How is it that in some ways we cannot imagine not existing? And why are so many of us filled with a deep desire for something beyond? I'm sure at some level many artists grapple with such questions. Of course, artists may come to varied answers. For my part, such a profound pining beyond my finitude is either some false psychological construct or a hunger for a God who gives us meaning. And I'm wagering on meaning. The psalmist in me cries out. Is it endlessness I crave? Why do you fill me with such desires for paradise, yearnings for eternity in you? Tell me why such longings never cease. Why in such longing I alone find peace. Your eternity that I pursue, nothing less than you will now suffice. In your presence, time itself holds still. Your eternity, and do not stand outside my world in timelessness. Every moment is inscribed in you. You enfold our hours in who you are. Millennia of every unseen star you in turn illuminate and bless, beaming forth what's infinite and true, holding nanoseconds in your hand. Your foreverness envelops me. Even if I have no need to climb out of worldly days, I'm overjoyed by eternal moments you avow. Let me feel your hidden nearness now. Breathe your spirit on our aeons void. Stoop down in beauty to redeem earth's time. Take me up in you, eternity. Those eternal moments are also a spur, a motivation. In the past, I knew several traditional Irish musicians who became so bewitched by the music they played, so addicted to the thrill of playing that nothing else seemed worth doing. They lived from one music session to the next. Music had taken them over. Again, I can only speak for myself, but once I discovered the high of making a poem, I knew that this had to be my life. Yet it's more than a simple addiction. It is a vocation, the whole edifice of a life. As Robert Frost famously said, to be a poet is not a profession, it is a condition. Whenever a younger person approaches me wondering if they should devote their lives to poetry, I always recommend what I call the Rilke test and refer them to the extraordinary passage from his letters to a young poet. Nobody can counsel and help you, nobody. There's only one single way. Go into yourself, search for the reason which bids you to write. Find out whether it's spreading its roots in the deepest places of your heart. Acknowledge to yourself whether you would have to die if you were denied to write. This, above all, ask yourself in the stillest hour of your night, must I write? Delve into yourself for a deep answer. And if this should be affirmative, if you may meet this earnest question with a strong and simple, I must, then build your life according to this necessity. Your life, even into its most indifferent and slightest hour, must be a sign of this urge and a testimony to it. While some artists, in their consciousness of how the wind blows over it and it's gone, in their search for understanding, may not wager on a God or find such a greater context. They are often, nevertheless, seeking a meaning in the world. Its place remembers it no more. Yet there is also, apart from the love of children and the passing on of life, an instinct to leave some artistic sign, some vestige of our being here. God, you know this ache to leave a trace, need to scratch, somehow make our mark, catching what no one ever can. Words we choose, trying hard to snatch moods that shift, matching them with now we crave both fixity and drift. Overtones climbing sweet desire drop in time, tearful semitones. Music yearns for both here and there. Paint holds on, canvassing delight, moments gone, longing clones in oil. Wistfulness both bemoans and fates. Every sound, pitch, and smear of clay, fearing loss, claims a holding place, space for where we can long for you. I suppose I share that instinct. While I want to see my life as serving creation, as playing my riffs for Madame Jazz, sometimes when wording a deeply felt emotion, something I'd only dare to say in a poem for fear of losing its sacredness, I think of those famous lines of the poet Patrick Kavanagh. Record love's mystery without claptrap, snatch out of time the passionate transitory. Many regard Kavanagh as a mystic, so luckily it's possible both to know the impulse to leave some trail behind and at the same time to accept one's role in God's greater scheme of things. Clearly, the vast majority of poems do not deal with the great questions of life and meaning. And yet it seems, at least for me, how I view such matters provides a backdrop to my world, establishes an angle of vision. Here I want to extend the semantic range of the word understanding. A comprehensive list of synonyms for understanding includes the adjective compassionate. Teach me heute mir und morgen dir. Turned around becomes compassion's core. All that's yours today, tomorrow's mine. Bach's St. Matthew and Rilke's elegies, Dietrich's Wann wird man je verstehen? Mein Gott, when will we ever understand? And still this understanding, this compassion is deeper when art seeks understanding that is not simply a dread that this may happen to me. There's also the thought that this might have happened to me, yet it's more. As Emmanuel Levinas, who did so much to introduce an ethical standpoint to philosophy, brought home to us. In a book of mine, A Fragile City, I tried to capture that understanding, that compassion as the face of another commanding me. Theft. Another wired photograph of an African woman holding a small girl with a pear-shaped head and a shriveled, crow-footed face. Has someone thieved a child, left her this elf instead? Drought, failed crops, and the rains too late. Hollows of famine rumble the bowels of the earth. Look long and deep. Unable to clean forget, I begin my day busy in the lap of the north. Little knoweth the fat what the lean doth mean. I can't ghost write a suffering, only my guess and leap, flickers of memory are the unforeseen. I know how easily a world unsheaths my tininess, but nothing appeases her stare. Again, I'll pore over this image of hunger. Is compassion a guilty fear of there but for fortune, or is there more? It's as though something in her gaze commands me, a look both rapt and implacable. There's no wool to pull over these eyes. Look long, look deeper. Cycles of dominance, hemispheres rise and fall. She stares and stares. Am I my sister's keeper? Most often, compassion is implied, but you know that the poet approaches the world with compassion. By the same token, when a poet lacks that fellow feeling, that understanding, there is a forbidding coldness that seldom, in my view, rises to great art. But let me stretch the concept of understanding just a little further. Some thesauruses will include wisdom as a possible synonym for understanding. And at the risk of pushing the St. Francis resonance in the title of this talk too far, I quote the use of wisdom in his prayer for serenity, where, while appealing to change what is possible, what's possible to change, he asks for la sagesse de connaître la différence, the wisdom to recognize the difference. In the world of poetry, the well-known dictum of Robert Frost comes to mind. Poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom. We need only think of the great Frost favorites, The Road Not Taken, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, which begin with delight in a description of nature and end with their wise and mysterious comments. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in the woods and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And of course, the other famous ending, even more famous, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I quote these so familiar lines for you because they combine in such a beautiful and unfathomable way the poignancy of our brief lives. All poems, even one's own, somehow dance past our understanding, retaining a mystery glanced but never entirely apprehended. Glimpse from a stillness beyond the rhythm's command, an inner stillness in the shifting view of dancers, to stand under a heaven we can never understand. Up to this, I've concentrated on the understanding, the first part of the title. Yes, the echo of St. Francis' prayer admonishes us to prioritize the understanding. Yet given this asymmetry between poet and reader, it's also logical to give pride of place to understanding. After all, it's the poet with the desire to snatch out of time the passionate transitory who does the attentive standing in the presence and wisely discerns the truth. Though the reader's role is certainly not passive in as much as they bring the sum of their own life to bear on the poem, they do not initiate the communication. However, the strange, inspired quality in a poem, which even poets, for all their authorial intent, cannot completely comprehend, brings me now to the second half of the title, that is to say, to be understood. As a poet, of course, I do want to be understood. Any poem is a communication, and I'm sure I speak for all poets that, though it's often at a subconscious level, I'm imagining I'm telling someone what has moved me, what I'm attempting to understand, and what I hope may give them a flutter too. I've always been fascinated how that being understood can stretch across centuries. I'm at an age where some of my lifelong friends have died, and when I grieve them, of course Shakespeare again is being understood. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow for precious friends hid in death's dark night. Or think of the poets who wrote the Psalms over some 500 years, how they are cries still understood daily across some 3 millennia. I lift mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. Do I, as a poet, worry about the number of people out there who will read what I write, who will find that it rings true to their experience, whose hearts and minds will be moved? Should the size of the readership be of concern to me? I always recall the poet Patrick Kavanagh expressing his own thoughts on this matter. Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish writer, he declared, thought a dozen readers was enough, but that was far too ambitious. That was far too ambitious. For his part, thought 5 or 6 were enough. He had his picker-uppers, as he called them. He had those who understood. I think the point here is a kind of trust that you will be understood. I have faith that if a poem has that something I have been describing, that our common humanity ensures that it will be understood. An often used image, which I think I recall being used by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, is the message in the bottle thrown into the sea and picked up. Personally, I remember as a boy reading about the Heaviside layer, which radio waves sent up, hit, and bounced down again. And it was higher at night, so the bounce reached further, and that is why growing up we could bring in foreign stations at night that we couldn't hear during the day. I think of poems as taking off and hitting our humanity's Heaviside layer and bouncing down so they are received, picked up by readers. For me, first readers have always been important. I've been very fortunate in this regard. My late wife, Beads, through nearly 44 years of our time, was my first reader, accompanied by my best friend, David Ford, the theologian. I was always confident that here I would be understood. On the other hand, if either of my first readers thought there was a false note or that something was off, I always listened and either reworked the poem or discarded it. One of the saddest memories of all my life was when I brought my late wife in the care home where she spent the end of her life the manuscript of one of the 5 quintets which I had just completed. She returned it to me the next day with a few shaky markings where she had attempted to proof the text, as she had always done, saying, "I can't anymore." My late wife suffered from Parkinson's, a phase of our love which I tried to describe in One Crimson Thread. I have been very blessed in finding love for a second time, and my wife Christina has been a wonderful first reader alongside David Ford. I can't be grateful enough for this, as before I take to heart any advice, any sense that something doesn't ring true. Once poems are published in a book, then there's the more public reception of the book, which can often entail reviews in various newspapers, journals, etc. If you're lucky, these can also be signals that you've been understood. But clearly, this is not always the case. I had a friend who maintained that when offered a book to review, you should only accept the offer if you are in tune with it and can be one who understands. Now, it's not that my friend believed in indiscriminate boosting, but simply reckoned that the book is in print, and what good will it do to slaughter it? Best to pass on it. I have myself tried to follow this, and only rarely reviewed, and then only when I appreciated a work. Sadly, however, out of the desire for a fee or to exhibit superiority, many succumb to the temptation to carp or show how a poet should have written a different poem or another kind of book. For my own part, I've been understood most of the time, but once or twice I have been slammed. I think that some of an almost mandatory negativity common in reviews stems from a simple misunderstanding or an altered interpretation of what the word critic means. In Greek, critic meant one who could discern or judge. I'm afraid the meaning has slowly come to mean to condemn harshly. The result of this is that some reviewers feel that they haven't earned their fee unless they find faults This regularly leads to a kind of sting-in-the-tail syndrome, where even though reviewers clearly like a work, they believe it incumbent on them to end a good review by mentioning what they consider to be the book's shortcomings. Even more deleterious was the phase in literary criticism when, exalted by theories, some literary critics declared themselves more significant than the author, who really didn't know at all how they were hidebound by circumstances which only the critic, with the aid of an all-embracing theory, could expound. George Steiner's Real Presence deals wonderfully with the phenomenon of secondary literature. Now, though as a student I avoided studying literature per se, as I deeply feared that cranking out essays to deadlines might dull my passion for literature, and for poetry in particular. I have the highest regard for the best of literary criticism. To my mind, to be understood in a broad and comprehensive way is a wonderful gift. One of the most outstanding examples of magnificent literary criticism I have read was an essay about Alexander Solzhenitsyn by an Orthodox priest, Alexander Schmemann. He explicated what he saw as Solzhenitsyn's view of the resurrection as expressed in his oeuvre. Solzhenitsyn, in fact, wrote to him, thanking him and telling him that he had, in fact, elucidated for him how the resurrection had pervaded his thought and work. I, too, thankfully, have had the privilege of, well, in a minor way, some similar experiences on a number of occasions. One such moment was when reading an essay in Musics of Belonging, a book of critical essays about my poetry, which was published in 1997. An essay in this volume demonstrated how there was a pattern to my books of poetry. By and large, once I had begun to write books which were thematically focused and which had a specific architectonic, it was shown that I tended to alternate between a highly personal subject and an issue of public concern. When I read this, it seemed so clear, yet, however strange it may seem, I had not been conscious of this previously. This is the kind of insight which literary discernment can offer both the poet and the reader. This brings me to the question how personal poetry and public poetry can be understood. Clearly, in both cases, a book will, for the most part, be read by the reader on his own. As I mentioned before, readers come to a poem with their own life history and imagination, and sometimes, in the case of more personal poetry, the relationship between poet and readers is one-to-one. I know I feel an intimate relationship with poets whose work I love, even if I've never met or could have met them. Here I think again of my best friend David Ford and his recently published Gospel of John, a theological commentary. And I quote, "So that love," you recognize the quote, of course, from the New Testament, from John, "so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them and I in them." Writing about John 12, he uses the term mutual indwelling. Is it too far-fetched to speak here of a kind of mutual indwelling in the truth and intensity of a poem? But how then is writing more public poetry to be understood? We are much less used to public poetry than we once were. What Charles Taylor in his wonderful A Secular Age shows as the dominance of the genuine has somehow eclipsed more public themes. Of course, Robert Browning, whose memorabilia are assembled here at Baylor, had written much public poetry. I do believe that much public poetry springs from what is more intimate. Yet clearly, when tackling public themes, I do want in some way, some tiny way, to better the world by speaking truth about how we as a society live and to create the conscious community of a book. In his inimical intellectual fashion, Steiner's A Real Presence asks if a poem, a painting, a musical composition can be created in the absence of God and argues that a transcendence sustains all genuine art. I have already made clear that I'm wagering on an ultimate meaning, which underpins every poem I write. But now I want to bring this talk full circle. I want to return to those cries for meaning and the Hebrew Psalms with which I began. In his commentary on John, David Ford reckons that John is encouraging us to see the abundance of the world and learning from how John improvises intertextually to be willing ourselves to improvise in turn on John in the ongoing drama of the world. The question, what does that mean for here and now in our lives, is what constantly calls for extemporization. So maybe now, in somewhat the same spirit, I can say that the Psalms also invite us to share in all those moods of rejoicing, of complaining, of meaning, of doubt, of thanksgiving, of questioning, of praise. Are we invited to live with them, to make them our own? And it may be that one form for appropriation is to improvise on them. In Testament, I have tried to do just that and cry out in my doubts, in my searching, in my gratitude, in my wonder, in a one-to-one with God, who, like the Hebrew psalmist, I trust is there, and would not fill our hearts with such desires for nothing. I don't attempt the parallelisms which are a feature of the original Psalms, but in my own voice and using mixtures of internal and end rhyme and various metrical patterns, and even melodeon patterns, I speak in the spirit of those poems which have traversed millennia. I hope, in understanding this human need to call out in my frailty, I may be understood. But surely you are not cruel or unkind. Why should this life which you both give and take be all? Why should you let us so evolve that we cannot conceive oblivion, or how our being won't continue on? We can't see how existence might dissolve, imagine sleep from which we wouldn't wake, or conjure up an absence of our mind. Although we know that clay returns to clay, you knit our bones with carbon from the stars, their residue in us still heaven high. Why fill us with your sweet eternal dream if everything you knit you soon unseam? If there is nothing more beyond, so why this hope and this belief that you've made ours? All these desires, could you then just betray and leave us in oblivion's no man's land? Our doubts attack what we can't apprehend. As dust, as grass, as flowers in the field, the wind blows over us and we are gone. Yet carbon dust in stars that once had shone will yearn for what you've promised, not revealed. For all complaining doubts still in the end, you know we trust, though we can't understand. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Did everybody hear the question, or I should probably repeat it somewhat? Bob asked me what the real connection between the insight which a poem may give into a situation or relationship, what the relationship between that and the form of the poem, basically, whether it's rhyme or alliteration or metaphor, whatever. I think I take very much the ancient Greek view of it. When you get the marriage of form and content, when they come together and meld, you're getting what you want to get. And I'm very conscious of form. I mean, I know that in America, form was something which was looked down on for a long time. And I think Charles Taylor puts his finger on it when he talks about the cult of the genuine. It was seen as not being having a spontaneity, if you like. If you were to think about form, then it wasn't really coming from your heart and so on. It wasn't just pouring out of you as it should. That, in a way, of course, is an extension of the romantic image of the poet, I think. Before that, you had the craftsman in all arts, and I take the craft of poetry very seriously. I don't know how much you would have noticed when I quoted from poems there, but they're all fairly formal. And in the Psalms, I've really enjoyed doing. I have a book of essays, and when I talked about form in it, and I went through a whole lot of things I love to do. One of them is what I call a melodeon poem, so that middle lines rhyme, but then the next line above rhymes with the line, and so on up. So the first line is going to rhyme with the last line, and it has a particular effect doing that. I've done an awful lot in these Psalms too of internal rhyme, so that each line has a rhyme in the next line, but not at the end, which gives a different effect. And I just like effect. But why? I don't. I mean, I've written poems without any rhyme. There's also other possibilities, and somebody like Levertov, for instance, doesn't use a lot of that, but I still think she's a very fine poet, so I wouldn't condemn that. But I just, since your lullabies, since you learned to skip, remember, wibblety wobbly gently on the plate. I mean, how can you forgo the thrill of such rhythms and such delights? I can't. So I think there is a connection. Obviously, then there is the connection between what is the insight and which form you choose. And for instance, I've always found the sonnet when I'm emotionally terribly taken to be a crucible, to be something can take it and hold it and mold it. One crimson thread, which I mentioned, which was how I got through the final 2.5 years of my first wife's life. And I got up at 6 every morning, and I kept writing sonnets right through. I did 150 sonnets right through her death and mourning. And I don't think I could have done if it wasn't a sonnet, because it somehow contained that deep emotion and gave it control enough for it to communicate, not just be me mourning. Does that answer your question somewhat? I was once warned never to ask that question, because I asked it one time in a reading, and the person said no. So I'm always a little bit nervous of asking it. Are there further questions? Lou. Lou was a poet, of course, too.
You quote Robert Frost, "One begins in delight and in wisdom." Makes me think of the other side of the spectrum. T.S. Eliot, poet occupied with frontiers of consciousness beyond which words fail, though meanings still exist. And I guess I'm interested in how you see this sort of the two poles of understanding and
Not being able to understand.
disagreement,
Yes.
right? Confidence that Frost displays in wisdom. Of course, he's kind of squirrely in his wisdom.
I don't get squirrely.
He's kind of, he seems very easy to understand, but
Yes.
in fact, he's very complex.
Exactly. There's depth. There's profundity, which he hides. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas Eliot, obviously, very difficult to grasp in some ways.
Yes. I've got to say that I'm a fan of the four of the four quartets. I have to get very careful not to get the quintets into this. The four quartets, I find them very deep and wonderful. I'm not as big a fan of the earlier stuff. I've got to say, I don't. There can be, for me, a little bit of obscurity, for the sake of it, which creates a kind of, dare I say, sort of screen of mystery, which doesn't actually take me so deeply. But obviously, we were talking in your talk this morning. We were talking about polarities. You know, like the Wendell Berry, you were talking about being. Sorry, keep this near my mouth. Talking about you know, being everything had to be local, as opposed to, you know, where does that leave somebody who's born in a city and writes poems about the city? I wouldn't go for either extreme. And I think when I quoted those endings to those Frost poems, they actually do catch that mystery very clearly. Miles to go before I sleep. I mean, presumably that's death. Presumably that's the end of life. But it's so beautifully, beautifully mysterious, you know, that it haunts you. I can just anecdotally say that when I got to know Frost first, it was an uncle of mine who had died, and I got his books. And I got a selected Frost, and I read through it. And the two poems that I immediately, never having looked at an anthology or anything, the two I picked out were those two. Whatever quality they have, they are just extraordinary. Both the stopping, the two I quoted from. Yes.
You mentioned the importance to you of David Ford and Goliath giving the first reading, and you said something along the lines of, "I was always understood." And it reminds me, I've been reading lately.
Reading, sorry?
Jacques Maritain.
Yes.
And he thinks that there's an essential part of knowing that has to be obtained only through a kind of first blush reading of a poem or of an artwork where you just obey, is the language that he uses. And that there's something in that knowing that is gained that could be lost if you start with a more reflexive or kind of explanatory kind of reading. And so I guess I would love to hear you say just a little bit more about, because I guess I'm connecting what you were saying about your wives and about David Ford and what they offered you when they talked with you about your poems versus a secondary kind of thing. Is that similar to what you're?
Yeah, I think there's two. I see two parts to what you're saying to me in a sense. The first part is the first blush, and I've often thought when you meet somebody for the first time, you see them in a way you never see them again. You know that the first impression you get of somebody is you never get that impression again. It's screened by talk and by history and all sorts of things. That's the sort of thing I think Jacques is talking about in that. But the other question, I don't think it's that particular first blush I'm thinking of in terms of my wife or David Ford reading the poems. I think it's more that I know that they read in love. I know that they're not there. There's no hint of jealousy. There's no hint of wanting to find fault for the sake of finding fault or being smart or anything like that. I know these people love me, and I know that their reaction will be one of love. In other words, they will tell me the truth. This either is genuine, this is you, this is it. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes they say, no, that doesn't ring true. And then I redo it because I know this is spoken out of love, not out of any other motive. I think that's what I was talking about in that sense. Thank you. Yes.
My question is for you as a craftsman. When you are forming a poem, how do you separate out the process of trying to come to your own understanding and also seeking to be understood? So for me, when I'm writing poetry, I find that if I am thinking of the other person too much, then I'm not coming to the depth of understanding that I need to. But on the other hand, I can work really hard to come to understanding and then leave the reader out. And so I'm wondering how you balance that out.
Yeah, in some ways, I think you've answered your own question. It's the balance, isn't it? It's a very, very delicate balance between the two. I mean, you're expressing something which is coming from you, but at the same time, it's very hard not to imagine it being read. And in a way, I think you have to make it understandable, because you've got to put yourself in the position of somebody else. You know, has have I explained what I'm talking about enough for somebody to pick it up? Is it too much me and it's not communicating? So I think it's that delicate balance between imagining that you're communicating to somebody and that somebody can follow this, because you do want people to follow it. So you have to stand outside it and think, can someone follow this? But at the same time, it's you talking, and it's your insight, or actually, I always think of myself as an instrument. It's an insight I'm being given because I'm a great believer in inspiration, the blowing into. There are two great traditions, of course. The Erleuchtung in German, or Himawaki in Japanese. Both of those are flashes of light. There's the two ways of thinking of that inspiration, either as being blown into, something blown through you as an instrument, or the other one is the flash of light. The flash of one is sight, you're faithful to that, but at the same time, I think you're always having to think, when the person is reading it, will they understand what I'm talking about? So it's a delicate balance between the two, to my mind. Are we dying of natural causes? Hello. Sorry, it's a little difficult to hear. Maybe for people over here it might be difficult as well.
I might have misunderstood you, but you mentioned this point, I think, in regards to understanding, where it is as if someone is before you commanding you. Did you say that?
No, not quite that. It was in the context of Levinas. It's the face in front of you commanding you. That was his great insight, Levinas. That the phrase commanding you I use in that context. It's because he was a Lithuanian Jew who ended up in Paris and was despised, I think, largely by Sartre and the existentialists for a long time. And now, of course, there's conferences all over about Levinas. But his great insight was how, was he saw, and it's true, he does this spiraling writing about it, but through the whole thing, it's the face of the other commanding you, is what saying, do not murder me, is what is the basics of ethics, according to Levinas. That's what I was referring to. But not necessarily that what you're looking at is commanding you, but you're standing in the presence of, is what I thought. Attentive presence, where you're discerning the truth from the false, all those ideas of understanding that I was talking about, and also holding on to it. That's why I went into that little etymological riff to try and catch that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope there wasn't a put down or anything, but that was just the two things crossed, I think. Hello, you're going to play the piano? No, sorry. Yes. 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 It's a Steinway if you do want to play.
Yeah, and my question has to do. I haven't seen the new book, but I wondered if you could comment a little bit on the role of the Psalter. I'm a biblical scholar. I've done translations of the Psalms and things like that, and there's well-known translations in translations and interpretations of the Psalms. Robert Alter's
Yes.
recent stuff is quite famous and well-known. And I wondered if you might reflect a little bit on how, if you've done such translation work yourself, or how you feel your work is inspired and constrained by the original literary form, if it is.
Well, thank you for your question. I've got to make a terrible admission. I don't know Hebrew. I've often thought I should, but I never did. So I have to make the terrible admission that I'm reading them in translation. One of the great people who inspired me, of course, was Ellen Davis's book, which I found very, very, very inspiring on the Psalms. But I think what brought me, if I can just give a little bit of the background as to why I came towards the Psalms, I was commissioned, it was an extraordinary business, I was commissioned to do a concert which was performed in Connecticut, in the church in Greenwich, Connecticut, twice, and it was a huge thing. I think it cost 90,000 or something to mount. But the commission was this Rob Mathis, who is a composer and arranger, who we chose psalms, and then I was to write Oh, thank you. Oh, am I on air again? I am. Good, thank you. So I was talking about this concert. I know how much you got of it, which I did with Rob Mathis, the composer. And as I said, we picked psalms, and I then wrote songs with a slight reference to the song, but it was actually a life cycle and so on. And it was wonderful. We had players from the Met in New York, and we had some wonderful jazz singers, and Rob used all styles from classic to blues, and it was an extraordinary thing. But that inspired me, because I began to think more and more about the psalm. I read a psalm every day because I follow a lectionary, but I began to think of them as a whole in a whole new way, and I was fascinated by them. And I thought to myself, I mumble like that. I mumble throughout the day to God about different things, and particularly when I lose my phone, I mumble terribly to God to find the damn thing again. So you do all the time throughout the day. I find, at least, and a lot of it is thanks. I'm really grateful, so grateful for the life I've had. So that was how I actually came to it. So I didn't try to echo, as I said, I didn't use the parallelisms. I didn't try to even echo the words of them, but more the mood of them, in a sense. But I have to admit that the mood is through translation. And I'm not a great person. I normally like to read things in the original, but I have never got down and learned Hebrew. I had Greek and Latin at school, but not Hebrew, sadly. Want to wrap it up, or? Oh yes, there's some. Hello, yes. It's like an auction. You've got to be very careful when you put your hand up. You don't know what you'd end up with.
This is partially probably already answered in parts.
Yes.
This is to do with, so you talked about kind of the tendency to rush to kind of arrogant, self-aggrandizing criticism, kind of criticism that just goes on the attack before bothers to try to understand what it's attacking. You've also at the same time stressed that there are poetic traditions or decent poetry that you don't particularly like, constructive, romantic ideas of poetry.
So what's the last? The things that I don't like. I can catch the next sentence.
Or that you think have been somewhat destructive.
Yes.
Elements of the romantic ideal of the poet, Eliot's early stuff. So I'm kind of curious as to how both as a critic and as a poet who's trying to do something in the life predecessors, how you kind of navigate wanting to be respectful of the reverence of what's been accomplished before, wanting to avoid kind of an arrogant dismissal that is all too common, while at the same time being judgmental of having that element to a certain degree.
Yes. Thank you for asking the question. No. Well, first of all, I don't do much criticism. In a book of essays which I published called "Say But the Word," which of course is from the "Say But the Word, and my soul shall be healed." But I did write about people I loved, and because I followed the advice I got. I mean, I wrote about, I think, about Herbert, and I wrote about poets that I really admired. But it is once you get into that, it is a delicate balance again, because you don't want to. I didn't mean to dismiss, by the way, Eliot's thing. I just say that I don't find myself going back to the early Eliot, but I won't dismiss him. And we may not have had the four quartets unless he'd written the ones before it. So I'm not going to be simplistically dismissive. I'm only saying that for richness, I returned to the four quintets. I don't really wouldn't like to be dismissive, but it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Between seeing it. But I think the original critic, though, idea was discerning what's good in it and discerning what it has to say, not necessarily discerning what book it should have been, which is what it falls into so often. And sadly, it's often by wannabes. That this is the great moment. I won't name names, but I had an extraordinary experience here. I was invited 5 years ago to read here under Richard's auspices, and one of the poets whom you invited had slaughtered me on one occasion in the Irish Times. I had to walk down Grafton Street in Dublin that Saturday morning, knowing that everybody had seen this slaughter. I then heard from somebody else that she had determined to make, I've said she, but that she had been determined to make her name by running people down. And that happens too. But actually, I'm grateful, Richard, because we had a lovely relationship here, and nothing was said, and so that was mended. But that is another tendency, I think, younger people trying to be smart and trying to make their name by cutting down other people. It's always been a little bit between generations, I think, in art. There are reactions, and they try to cut down the previous generation. I never felt that myself. I felt that. I've always felt reverence for people who devoted their life to something I wanted to devote my life to. John.
Your work speaks to many, and I'm just wondering if you have any examples of how your own work has spoken back to you in surprising ways.
Oh my gosh. No, I'm just trying to think. I'm just trying to think how my own work speak back to me. Gosh. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, John. If I can get my head around the idea of my own work speaking to me. Can you explicit? Yes. 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 Particularly if you read, because then I think you're into performance. Now, by performance, I don't mean these open mics and slams and thing. I'm too much of a craftsman to quite swallow that. But I know what you mean. No, it's like I'm. Oh, let me say it. I am learning the piano again at this age, and my piano teacher says to me, let go, because performance means that every time you play it differently. And there's a bit about that also when you're reading a poem, depending on how the cadence falls, how you're talking, and even audience feedback, because there's an element of theatre in it. If you talk to actors, they'll always say, different audience. It was such an audience tonight, or it was a different audience from last night. They laughed at different places, or they react. And you actually, when you're reading, if you have that sense, you feel it back. So it does change the way you read it. In that sense, yes, you do discover new emphasis and so forth in the performance of it. But as far as knowing it, I have discovered when I'm asked, can I contribute a poem on such and such a subject, I have to ring up David Ford and ask him, because I can't remember. I'm so involved in what I'm doing and where I'm going, I can't remember them all, but he can. Yes?
So this is, can you hear me?
Yes, do you want to take this for a second? I'll share it with you. My lolly.
Thank you very much. What would you say to someone who would like to start poetry? So some tips, and also just general things that they could do to better their craft.
Thank you. Gosh, sometimes I have been, as part of the deal when I was asked to read, I had to do a workshop. I always tried not to, but sometimes it was Paris was worth a mass, and so I did it in order to read at the particular place I thought it'd be nice to read. What I always say really is, look, find your own voice, do what you've got to do, because I could never say to someone, substitute this word for this word, or do that, because it has to come from you. In terms of craft, probably read. I would say read poets. Find your favorite poets. find the people who inspire you, and then get it into your idiom and into yourself. That thing. And of course, the Rilke test, which I spoke of, stay well clear of it if you can. But if you can't, then order your life by that necessity. But I couldn't do it. I mean, I showed respect for people always if I had to do that workshop, and I listened to what they had to say and tried to understand what they were trying to get across. But I would never, I remember once I was told, oh, don't use the word sorrow, grief is much better. So, I can't do that sort of thing. I hope that's not too evasive an answer. Thank you. Well, thank you for your question. I think every language is utterly different, has a different sense, a different feel, and so on to it. If you emotionally, I pray in Irish. It was what I spoke to my first wife for 44 years. It wouldn't have been natural for us to talk anything else. It was actually a very difficult decision for me that I was writing in English, because I love Irish. It was something very important to me, but it was a moral decision, because the number of people who are going to read, or the people who are going to reach in Irish, is very, very tiny. And a lot of, even if people buy books, sometimes they were buying them out of piety. And so yes, you feel emotional connections to a language. There's no doubt about it. And in that language, there's a whole atmosphere. There's a whole way of being. And I think that's the secret to learning a language, is actually giving into that way of being, and adopting a new personality, being plastic enough to take a whole new personality into yourself, a whole set of references, a whole new feeling. Don't the Germans talk about Sprachgefühl, the language feel, which is very, very, very is thing. For me, it's also connected with people. If I take up the phone and somebody talks in Icelandic, when I know that voice, I'm in Icelandic immediately. But the voice just brings me in. I talk Japanese to a friend every week on the phone. I hear her voice, I'm off. So it has to do with that sense of, it's a whole sense of being and feeling and so forth. And so I don't think one is superior to the other, but each one will have its own atmosphere, its own way of being. I also broke all the rules, because when I was learning any language, everybody says, oh, poetry, you don't. I started with poetry, because I felt poetry was the nearest to the rhythm of the language. If you see what I mean, it was a distilled rhythm of the language, and therefore a great way to get that feeling. It won't tell you how to buy something in a shop or anything, but it does give you a deep sense of the spirit of the language. The Japanese talk about this, also about the spirit of a language, which is a great concept.